Thank you, Mr. Cook. Mr. Zuckerberg is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Before I begin, I want to add my voice to those honoring Congressman John Lewis and his service to our country. America has lost a real hero who never stopped fighting for the rights of every person. Chairman Cicelline, Ranking Member Sensenbrenner, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. The tech industry is an American success story. The products we build have changed the world and improved people's lives. Our industry is one of the ways that America shares its values with the world and one of our greatest economic and cultural exports. Facebook is part of this story. We started with an idea to give people the power to share and connect, and we've built services that billions of people find useful. I'm proud that we've given people who've never had a voice before the opportunity to be heard, and given small businesses access to tools that only the largest players used to have. Since COVID emerged, I'm proud that people have used our services to stay in touch with friends and family who they can't be with in person, and to keep their small businesses running online when physical stores are closed. I believe that Facebook and the US tech industry are a force for innovation and empowering people, but I recognize that there are concerns about the size and power of tech companies. Our services are about connection, and our business model is advertising, and we face intense competition in both. Many of our competitors have hundreds of millions or billions of users. Some are upstarts, but others are gatekeepers with the power to decide if we can even release our apps in their app stores to compete with them. In many areas, we're behind our competitors. The most popular messaging service in the US is iMessage. The fastest growing app is TikTok. The most popular app for video is YouTube. The fastest growing ads platform is Amazon. The largest ads platform is Google. And for every dollar spent on advertising in the US, less than 10 cents is spent with us. We're here to talk about online platforms, but I think the true nature of competition is much broader. When Google bought YouTube, they could compete against the dominant player in video, which is the cable industry. When Amazon bought Whole Foods, they could compete against Kroger's and Walmart. When Facebook bought WhatsApp, we could compete against telcos who used to charge 10 cents a text message, but not anymore. Now people can watch video, get groceries delivered, and send private messages for free. That's competition. New companies are created all the time, all over the world. And history shows that if we don't keep innovating, someone will replace every company here today. And that change can often happen faster than you expect. Of the 10 most valuable companies a decade ago, only 3 still make that list today. And if you look at where the top technology companies come from, a decade ago, the vast majority were American. Today, almost half are Chinese. Aside from competition, there are other serious issues related to the internet, including questions about elections, harmful content, and privacy. And while these are not antitrust issues and are not specifically the topic of today's hearing, I recognize that we are often at the center of these discussions. We build platforms for sharing ideas, and important debates play out across our services. I believe that this ultimately leads to more progress, but it means we often find ourselves in the middle of deep disagreements about social issues and high-stakes elections. I personally don't believe that private companies should be making so many decisions about these issues by themselves. And that's why last year, I made the case that there needs to be new regulation for the internet. Facebook stands for a set of basic principles: giving people voice and economic opportunity, keeping people safe, upholding democratic traditions like freedom of expression and voting, and enabling an open and competitive marketplace. These are fundamental values for most of us, but not for everyone in the world. Not for every company we compete with or the countries they represent. And as global competition increases, there is no guarantee that our values will win out. I'm proud of the services we build and how they improve people's lives. We compete hard. We compete fairly. We try to be the best. That's what I was taught matters in this country. And when we succeed, it's because we deliver great experiences that people love. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, and I thank the witnesses for your opening statements. Before I begin recognizing members for questioning under the 5-minute rule, without objection, I'm going to enter into the hearing record the documents and exhibits majority members will be referencing in their questioning today. These materials have been distributed to the witnesses. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Pichai, over 85% of all online searches go through Google. Every online company in the United States depends on Google to reach users. A business may sink or swim based on Google's decisions alone. Numerous online businesses told us that Google steals their content and privileges its own sites in ways that profit Google but crush everyone else. Most businesses asked to stay anonymous due to fears that Google would retaliate against them. One entrepreneur, Brian Warner, told us his website was thriving until Google stole his content. After Google's decision, traffic to his website dropped by 80%. He had to downsize his business and lay off half his staff. He told us, and I quote, "If someone came to me with an idea for a website or a web service today, I'd tell them to run as far away from the web as possible. Launch a lawn care business or dog grooming business, something Google can't take away as soon as he or she is thriving." So my first question, Mr. Pichai, is why does Google steal content from honest businesses?
Mr. Chairman, with respect, I disagree with that characterization. Just last week, I met with many small businesses. In fact, today we support 1.4 million small businesses, supporting over $385 billion in economic activity. We see many businesses thrive, particularly even during the pandemic. Businesses, an example, Kettle Kings in Texas, which sells kettlebells. They've really
Mr. Pichai,
expanded.
I have a limited amount of time, so I don't want to interrupt you, but my question is very specific. We heard throughout this investigation that Google has stolen content to build your own business. These are consistent reports, and so your testimony that doesn't happen is really inconsistent with what we've learned during the course of the investigation, but I'll move on to a new question. Mr. Pichai, most Americans believe that when they enter a search query that what Google shows are the most relevant results. But increasingly, Google just shows whatever is most profitable for Google, be it Google Ads or Google's own sites. And so my question, Mr. Pichai, isn't there a fundamental conflict of interest between serving users who want to access the best and most relevant information and Google's business model, which incentivizes Google to sell ads and keep users on Google's own sites?
We've always focused on providing users the most relevant information, and we rely on the trust for users to come back to Google every day. In fact, a vast majority of queries in Google, we don't show ads at all, and we show ads only for a small subset of queries where the intent from users is highly commercial. For example, they may be looking for something like TV sets or so on.
But Mr. Pichai, what is the value of the part that you do use the Google ads for? I mean, it's a substantial part of your business. What's the actual value? 200 billion, 300 billion?
In terms of revenue, it's around $100+ billion. Okay. But
that's a lot of money, Mr. Pichai. Let me move on. Really, Mr. Pichai, it's Google's business model that is the problem. Our documents show that Google evolved from a turnstile to the rest of the web to a walled garden that increasingly keeps users within its sites. Emails show that over a decade ago, Google started to fear competition from certain websites, web pages that could divert search traffic and revenue from Google. These documents show that Google staff discussed the proliferating threat, is how it was described, that these web pages pose to Google. Any traffic lost to other sites was a loss in revenue. One of Google's memos observed that certain websites were getting, and I quote, too much traffic. So Google decided to put an end to that. Mr. Pichai, you've been at Google since 2004. Were you involved in these discussions about the threat from vertical search?
Congressman, without knowing the specifics, it's, I'm not fully clear of the context, but definitely when we look at vertical searches, it validates the competition we see. For example, when users come looking to shop online, independent studies show that over 55% of product searches originate with Amazon and over 70% originate with the major e-commerce companies. In the few categories which are commercial in nature, we see vigorous competition, be it travel, be it real estate, and we are working hard, focused on
let me ask
users
very specifically, Mr. Pichai.
there.
The evidence that we collected shows that Google pursued a multi-pronged attack. First, Google began to steal other web pages' content. For example, in 2010, Google stole restaurant reviews from Yelp to bootstrap its own rival local search business. Mr. Pichai, do you know how Google responded when Yelp asked you to stop stealing their reviews? Well, I'll tell you, our investigation shows that Google's response was to threaten to delist Yelp entirely. In other words, the choice Google gave Yelp was, let us steal your content or effectively disappear from the web. Mr. Pichai, isn't that anti-competitive?
Congressman, when I run the company, I'm really focused on giving users what they want. We conduct ourselves to the highest standard. Happy to engage, understand the specifics, and answer your questions further.
Thank you. And just one final series of questions, Mr. Pichai. Did Google ever use its surveillance over web traffic to identify competitive threats?
Congressman, just like other businesses, we try to understand trends from data which we can see, and we use it to improve our products for our users. But we are really focused on improving our products, and that's how search
I appreciate
works.
that, Mr. Pichai. Google's own documents and numerous interviews with companies affected by this conduct show that Google did just that, which is very disturbing and very anti-competitive. In addition to stealing content, Google also began to privilege its own sites. An investigative report published just yesterday found that 63% of web searches that start on Google also end somewhere on Google's own websites. And to me, that's evidence that Google is increasingly a walled garden, which keeps users on Google sites, even if Google doesn't have the most relevant information and it's economically catastrophic for other companies online. And so my time is running out, but Mr. Pichai, I'll just end by saying the evidence seems very clear to me. As Google became the gateway to the internet, it began to abuse its power. It used its surveillance over web traffic to identify competitive threats and crush them. It has dampened innovation and new business growth, and it's dramatically increased the price of accessing users on the internet, virtually ensuring that any business that wants to be found on the web must pay Google a tax. And with that, I recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Sensenbrenner, for his first round of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've been in Congress 42 years. That's coming to an end at the end of this year. I'm breathing a sigh of relief. But during that period of time, during the decade of the 90s and the zeros, I was involved as chairman of the Science Committee and chairman of this committee, and trying to make the net universal, and open it up to everybody. And one of the theses that we used is the net should end up becoming basically the debate on issues, not only in our country, but throughout the world. And in exchange for that, this committee and the Congress gave internet service providers immunity, so if somebody said something defamatory in what they posted, the ISPs could not be a part of a lawsuit for defamation. Now, after hearing Mr. Jordan give a long line of censorship of conservative viewpoints, I'm concerned that the people who manage the net, and the four of you manage a big part of the net, are ending up using this as a political screen. Conservatives are consumers too. And the way the net was put together in the eyes of Congress is that everybody should be able to speak their mind. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Jordan's litany of censorship zeroes in on Facebook. Exactly what are your standards in, quote, filtering out political speech that maybe some people out there don't agree with?
Congressman, thank you for the opportunity to address this. Our goal is to offer a platform for all ideas. We want to give everyone in the world a voice to share their experiences and ideas. A lot of that is day-to-day things that happen in their lives. Some of it is political. And frankly, I think that we've distinguished ourselves as one of the companies that defends free expression the most. We do have community standards around things that you can and cannot say. I think you would likely agree with most of them. They ban categories of harm such as promoting terrorist propaganda, child exploitation, incitement of violence, some more legalistic things like intellectual property violations, and they also ban things like hate speech that could lead to dehumanizing people and encouraging violence down the road.
If I may ask a specific of you, it was reported that Donald Trump Jr. got taken down for a period of time because he put something up on the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. Now, I wouldn't take it myself, but there still is a debate on whether it is effective either in treating or preventing COVID-19. And I think that this is a legitimate matter of discussion, and it would be up to a patient and their doctor to determine whether hydroxychloroquine was the correct medication, given the circumstances. Now, why did that happen?
Congressman, well, first, to be clear, I think what you might be referring to happened on Twitter, so it's hard for me to speak to that, but I can talk to our policies about this. We do prohibit content that will lead to imminent risk of harm, and stating that there's a proven cure for COVID when there is in fact none might encourage someone to go take something that could have some adverse effects. So we do take that down. We do not prohibit discussion around trials of drugs or people saying that they think that things might work or personal experiences with experimental drugs. But if someone is going to say that something is proven when in fact it is not, that could lead people
wouldn't that be up for somebody on the other side of the issue to say that this is not proven? And, I know as a fact that, for people with certain conditions, it's contraindicated and they shouldn't take it on that. But wouldn't that be up to somebody else, to say, okay, what somebody posted on this really isn't true, and here's what the facts are, rather than having a Twitter or a Facebook take it down?
Congressman, in general, I agree with you, and we do not want to become the arbiters of truth. I think that would be a bad position for us to be in, and not what we should be doing. But on specific claims, if someone is going to go out and say that hydroxychloroquine is proven to cure COVID, when in fact it has not been proven to cure COVID, and that statement could lead people to take a drug that in some cases, some of the data suggests that it might be harmful to people, we think that we should take that down. That could cause imminent risk of harm.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the distinguished chair of the full Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler from New York, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, I want to thank you for providing us information during our investigation. However, the documents you provided tell a very disturbing story. And that story is that Facebook saw Instagram as a powerful threat that could siphon business away from Facebook. And so rather than compete with it, Facebook bought it. This is exactly the type of anti-competitive acquisition that the antitrust laws were designed to prevent. Now, let me explain what I mean. Mr. Zuckerberg, you have written that Facebook can likely always just buy any competitive startups. In fact, on the day Facebook bought Instagram, which you described as a threat, you wrote, quote, "One thing about startups is you can often acquire them," close quote. Mr. Zuckerberg, you were referring to companies like Instagram in that quote, weren't you?
Congressman, I don't have the exact document in front of me, but I've always been clear that we viewed Instagram both as a competitor and as a complement to our services. In the growing space around, after smartphones started getting big, and they competed with us in the space of mobile cameras and mobile photo sharing. But at the time, almost no one thought of them as a general social network. And people didn't think of them as competing with us in that space. And I think that the acquisition has been wildly successful. We were able to by acquiring them, continue investing in it and growing it as a standalone brand that now reaches many more people than I think either Kevin, the co-founder, or I thought would be possible at the time, while also incorporating some of the technology into making Facebook's photos sharing products better. So yes.
Okay. Now, in early 2012, when Facebook contemplated acquiring Instagram, a competitive startup, you told your CFO that though nascent, Instagram could be very disruptive to us. And in the weeks leading up to the deal, you described Instagram as a threat, saying that, quote, Instagram can meaningfully hurt us without becoming a huge business, unquote. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg, what did you mean when you described Instagram as a threat, as disruptive? And when you said that Instagram could meaningfully hurt Facebook, did you mean that consumers might switch from Facebook to Instagram?
Congressman, thanks for the opportunity to address this. At the time, there was a small but growing field of
Did you mean that consumers might switch from Facebook to Instagram? That was my question.
Thanks, Congressman.
Yes or no? Did you mean that?
In the space of mobile photos and camera apps, which was growing, they were a competitor. I've been clear about that. And
fine. In February of that year, in February 2012, you told Facebook's chief financial officer that you were interested in buying Instagram. He asked you whether the purpose of the deal was to neutralize a potential competitor or to integrate their products with ours in order to improve our services. You answered that it was a combination of both, saying what we're really buying is time. Even if some new competitors springs up, those products won't get much traction since we'll already have their mechanics deployed at scale. Mr. Zuckerberg, what did you mean when you answered that the purpose of the deal was to neutralize a potential competitor?
Congressman, well, those aren't my words, but yes, I've been clear that Instagram was a competitor in the space of mobile photo sharing. There were a lot of others at the time. They competed with apps like ViscoCam and PicPlease and companies like Path. It was a subset of the overall space of connecting that we exist in. And by having them join us, they certainly went from being a competitor in the space of being a mobile camera to an app that we could help grow and help get more people to be able to use and be on our team. And I think that's been wildly successful.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, mergers and acquisitions that buy off potential competitive threats violate the antitrust laws. In your own words, you purchased Instagram to neutralize a competitive threat. If this was an illegal merger at the time of the transaction, why shouldn't Instagram now be broken off into a separate company?
Well, Congressman, I think the FTC had all of these documents and reviewed this and unanimously voted at the time not to challenge the acquisition. I mean, I think with hindsight, it probably looks like obvious that Instagram would have reached the scale that it has today, but at the time it was far from obvious. A lot of the competitors that they competed with in mobile sharing, including companies like Path, which were hot at the time and had great founders and entrepreneurs running them. Dave Moore and I worked closely with him. I don't even think Path exists today. It was not a guarantee that Instagram was going to succeed. The acquisition has done wildly well, largely because not just of the founders' talent, but because we invested heavily in building up the infrastructure and promoting it and working on security and working on a lot of things around this. And I think that this has been an American success story.
Well, thank you. Mr. Zuckerberg, you're making my point. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I want to end where I began. Facebook, by Mr. Zuckerberg's own admission and by the documents we have from the time, Facebook saw Instagram as a threat that could potentially siphon business away from Facebook. And so rather than compete with it, Facebook bought it. This is exactly the type of anti-competitive acquisition that the antitrust laws were designed to prevent. This should never have happened in the first place. It should never have been permitted to happen, and it cannot happen again. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would remind the witness that the failures of the FTC in 2012, of course, do not alleviate the antitrust challenges that the chairman described. And with that, I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Colorado, and again, thank him for co-hosting one of the most important field hearings we had along with Mr. Neguse in Colorado that I think was very critical in this investigation. And you're recognized from 5 minutes, Mr. Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to offer my appreciation to you for the bipartisan way that you have approached the subcommittee's investigation. I want to start by saying that capitalism is the greatest instrument for freedom this world has ever seen. Capitalism has given the United States the freedom and means to defeat the Soviet Union, beat back fascism, and put a man on the moon. This economic system has lifted millions out of poverty. It has made America the freest, most prosperous nation in the world. Our witnesses have taken ideas born out of a dorm room, a garage, a warehouse, and built these dreams into 4 of the biggest power players in the digital global economy. You have all enjoyed the freedom to succeed. Now, let me be clear. I do not believe big is necessarily bad. In fact, big is often a force for good. However, I want to address one particularly disturbing issue. Mr. Pichai, in October 2018, Google dropped out of the running for a Pentagon contract to complete the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, or JEDI contract, which was valued at more than $10 billion. Google's stated reason for removing itself from the bidding process is that the U.S. military's project did not align with Google's corporate values and principles. This is the same U.S. military that fights for our freedoms and stands as a force for good across the globe. These are the same soldiers, sailors, and airmen that sacrifice their lives to ensure you have the freedom to build your company and set your corporate policies without fear of government interference, unlike in communist China. I also find it very interesting that only months after making this decision to withdraw from the JEDI contract, Marine General Joseph Dunford, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned the Senate Armed Forces Committee that the Chinese military was directly benefiting from Google's work. It made me wonder what values Google and communist Red China had in common. I asked myself, is it that the Chinese Communist Party imprisons Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, like it is shown on the chart behind me? Could it be that China forces slaves to work in sweatshops? Maybe they align on the design to suppress free speech in Hong Kong. Did Google agree with CCP's decision to lie to the world about the COVID-19 pandemic? Then I thought about Google's Dragonfly experiment. I wondered if perhaps you agreed with the Chinese government's use of technology platforms to spy on its own people and enforce draconian security laws. Maybe it's that your company is aligned with the Chinese Communist Party's corporate espionage policies, where the strategy is to steal whatever can't be produced domestically. These values that allow Google to work with the Chinese military but not the U.S. military help explain why Google wouldn't think twice about blatantly stealing a competitor's product, right down to the watermark, without any hint of attribution. Mr. Pichai, during our field hearing in my home state of Colorado, I heard a story that sounded so brazen and contrary to free market principles that I thought it must have been straight from the Chinese Communist Party's corporate espionage playbook. Google took advantage of a company that relied on your search engine to build its brand and compete. Google misappropriated lyrics from Genius Media Group's website and published those lyrics on Google's own platform. However, Genius caught Google in the act, quite literally red-handed. When Genius suspected this corporate theft was occurring, the company incorporated a digital watermark in its lyrics that spelled out red-handed. In Morse code, Google's lyric boxes contained the watermark, showing that your company stole what you couldn't or didn't want to produce yourself. After Google executives stated that they were investigating this problematic behavior, Genius created another experiment to determine the scope of the misappropriation. It turns out that out of 271 songs where the watermark was applied, 43% showed clear evidence of matching. Your company, which advertises itself as a doorway to freedom, took advantage of this small company, all but extinguishing Genius's freedom to compete. Google is supposed to connect people to information. Your corporate values once stood for freedom, a platform that let capitalism flourish and helped bring countless people across the globe out of poverty. My question to you, Mr. Pichai, do you think that Google could get away with following China's corporate espionage playbook if you didn't have a monopolistic advantage in the market?
Congressman, I want to be able to address the important concerns you raised. First of all, we are proud to support the U.S. government. We recently signed a big project with the Department of Defense where we are bringing our world-class, zero trust-based cybersecurity approach to help protect Pentagon networks from cybersecurity attacks. We have projects underway with the Navy, with Department of Veterans Affairs. Happy to follow up and explain more. We have a very limited presence in China. We don't offer any of our services, search, maps, Gmail, YouTube, etc. in China. And with respect to music, We license content there. In fact, we license content from other companies. And so this is a dispute between Genius and the other companies in terms of where the source of the content is. But again, happy to engage and explain what we do here further.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cook, with over 100 million iPhone users in the United States alone, and with Apple's ownership of the App Store, giving Apple the ability to control which apps are allowed to be marketed to Apple users, you wield immense power over small businesses to grow and prosper. Apple is the sole decision maker as to whether an app is made available to app users through Apple's App Store. Isn't that correct?
Sir, the App Store, thank you for the questions. The App Store is a feature of the iPhone, much like the camera is and the chip is.
Yeah.
And so
my point is, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to get to the point. Point is that Apple is the sole decision maker as to whether an app is made available to app users through the Apple Store. Isn't that correct?
If it's a native app, yes, sir. If it's a web app, no.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And throughout our investigation, we've heard concerns that rules governing the App Store review process are not available to the app developers. The rules are made up as you go. They are arbitrarily interpreted and enforced and are subject to change whenever Apple sees fit to change. And developers have no choice but to go along with the changes, or they must leave the App Store. That's an enormous amount of power. Also, the rules get changed to benefit Apple at the expense of app developers, and the App Store is said to also discriminate between app developers with similar apps on the Apple platform, and also as to small app developers versus large app developers. So, Mr. Cook, does Apple not treat all app developers equally?
Sir, we treat every developer the same. We have open and transparent rules. It's a rigorous process. Because we care so deeply about privacy and security and quality, we do look at every app before it goes on. But those rules apply evenly to everyone. And as you can tell by going from...
Some developers are favored over others, though. Isn't that correct?
That is not correct. And as you can tell from going from just 500...
I'll give you an example. Baidu has two App Store employees assigned to help it navigate the App Store bureaucracy. Is that true?
I don't know about that, sir.
Well, you don't have other app developers who have that same access to Apple personnel, do you?
We do a lot of things with developers, including looking at their beta test apps, regardless of whether they're small or large.
Okay, well, let me ask you this question. Apple has negotiated exceptions to its typical 30% commission for some apps like Amazon Prime. Is a reduced commission such as the one that Amazon Prime gets available to other app developers?
It's available to anyone meeting the conditions, yes.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Apple requires all app developers to use Apple's payment processing system if those developers want to sell their goods or services to Apple users through Apple's App Store. Isn't that correct?
That is correct, because it's
by processing payments for apps that you allow into the App Store, you collect their customer data and you use that data to inform Apple as to whether whether or not it would be profitable for Apple to launch a competing app. Isn't that correct?
Sir, 84% of the apps are charged nothing. The remaining 16% either pay 15 or 30, depending upon the the specifics. If it's in the second year of a subscription, as an example, it only pays 15%. If you look back at history,
what's to stop Apple from increasing its commission to 50%?
Sir, we have never increased commissions in the store since the first day it operated in 2008.
There's nothing to stop you from doing so, is it?
No, sir, I disagree strongly with that. There is a competition for developers just like there's a competition for customers. And so the competition for developers, they can write their apps for Android or Windows or Xbox or PlayStation. So we have fierce competition at the developer side and the customer side, which is essentially, it's so competitive, I would describe it as a street fight for market share in the smartphone business.
Has Apple ever retaliated against or disadvantaged a developer who went public about their frustrations with the App Store?
Sir, we do not retaliate or bully people. It's strongly against our company culture.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz.
Mr. Zuckerberg, in his written testimony, made the claim that Facebook is an American company with American values. Do any of the rest of you take a different view? That is to say that your companies don't embrace American values? It's great to see that none of you do. Mr. Pichai, I'm worried about Google's market power, how it concentrates that power, and then ultimately how it wields it. Project Maven was a collaboration between Google and the Department of Defense that Google pulled out of, citing ethical concerns, and you made the decision to pull out of that joint venture following receipt of a letter from thousands of your employees saying that Google should not be in the business of war. My question, Mr. Pichai, is did you weigh the input from your employees when making the decision to abandon that project with the United States military?